from the top floor of the most exclusive penthouse in Los Angeles, where the city lights looked like jewels scattered across a dark velvet carpet. Theo Santoro watched the world like someone who had conquered everything, and yet still longed for something he couldn't name. At 34, he was the embodiment of modern success, CEO of one of the country's most innovative startups, cover of business magazines, a regular presence at gala events and social causes. Elegant, cultured, generous, and openly gay since the age of 22. His relationship with Raphael was stable, beautiful, even envied by many. But the truth was that something had changed, and no one knew, not even him. That night, as soft French jazz played in the background and a glass of ruby wine rested between his long fingers, Theo wore a tailored suit that no longer seemed to fit his soul. He was tired, not in body, but in spirit. The kind of exhaustion no vacation or standing ovation can fix. It was the weight of smiling with his lips while his eyes wandered to places even he didn't understand. Raphael was in the bedroom, lying on the bed, reading a scientific article. Theo looked at him from afar and felt a sharp ache in his chest. He loved Raphael, but not in the same way anymore, and that filled him with guilt. The companionship was still there, the tenderness, the admiration, but the passion, the spark, the desire to build a future, all of it had quietly faded, without anyone noticing, and he didn't know how to say that without destroying what still remained between them. He turned back to the window. The buildings shimmered like promises, but he felt alone. A sophisticated loneliness, dressed in luxury, surrounded by everything, yet internally empty, like a man at a party where everyone is dancing, except him. And it was this invisible dance he had started to question. Theo took a deep breath. He thought about his social projects, about the speeches he gave on authenticity, on freedom, on love, but he could no longer speak those words with honesty. Something inside him cried out for transformation, something he didn't yet understand. Little did he know that just a few blocks away, in a forgotten public school, there was a woman with large eyes and a gentle voice who carried in her hands the gift of awakening everything that had fallen asleep inside him. And very soon, fate would intertwine their paths in a way that would change everything. Because no matter how much we try to control the course of our story, love, true love, always finds a way in, even when we don't call for it, even when we believe it's no longer possible. There was something sacred in the way Raphael Diniz looked at Theo. It wasn't just love, it was loyalty, shared history, a silent promise. At 32, Raphael was everything many hoped to find. Intelligent, kind, successful, with a smile that felt like a warm embrace. A doctor at a renowned hospital, he split his days between saving lives and keeping his relationship with Theo running like a well-oiled machine. Or so he believed until recently. In the early years, their love had been almost cinematic. Candlelit dinners, spontaneous trips, handwritten notes hidden in suit jacket pockets. The kind of connection that felt unshakable. Raphael believed in that with the conviction of someone who had built everything on solid ground. But in the past few weeks, or perhaps months, the silence between them began to speak louder than their conversations. The touches had grown colder, the glances more distant. Theo had changed. And Raphael, though reluctant to admit it, could feel it in the air. That night, lying on the wide bed in their minimalist bedroom, Raphael was reading a medical article on sleep disorders, but not absorbing a single word. His eyes kept drifting toward the doorframe, waiting for Theo to return from the balcony. It wasn't the first time he found him out there, lost in thought, wine in hand, eyes fixed on a distance only he could see. Fear began to grow inside him. Not the fear of physical betrayal, that Raphael could forgive, but the fear of losing his place in the heart of someone he loved more than anything in the world. He closed the laptop and got up, walking barefoot to the kitchen. The soft lighting reflected on the marble floor. Everything in that apartment was perfect, beautiful, intentional. But inside him, there was an echo of abandonment settling in. Raphael was a rational man, used to dealing with diagnoses, crises, chemical reactions. But love doesn't follow formulas. And when it comes to feeling, even the most logical become vulnerable. He opened the fridge, took out some juice, and froze. He remembered their first dinner together. The first time he really saw Theo, not as the admired CEO, but as the man who trembled when speaking about his childhood wounds, about the fear of not being accepted, about the father who had kicked him out at 17. Raphael had cared for those wounds, had loved every scar, and now he felt like he was being left behind. Not for another man, but for a growing void inside Theo he could no longer reach. He returned to the bedroom and lay down in silence. Theo still hadn't come back. He looked at the empty side of the bed and, for the first time, felt that maybe love wasn't enough. Not because it had ended, but because the other was no longer fully there. And the most painful part was realizing that even when you do everything right, sometimes love doesn't die from neglect. It dies because the other chooses to leave. Within the peeling walls of a public school in the North Zone of Los Angeles, there was a cramped classroom with a noisy ceiling fan, windows that barely opened, and dozens of scratched-up chairs. There, in the quiet chaos of neglect, taught Clara Noguera, 26 years old, an arts teacher with the soul of an artist, the strength of a warrior, and eyes that held more light than any broken window could ever offer. She was the kind of woman who didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. Just being near her was enough to feel that there was something in her that couldn't be boxed, labeled, or easily defined. Clara was beautiful, but not in a fabricated way. It was real beauty, the kind that lives in the way she tied her hair up with a pencil, in her shy smile that lit up her face without makeup, in the calm of someone who's cried in silence many times and still chose to believe in people. She wore simple t-shirts, worn-out jeans, and always carried a hardcover sketchbook in her bag, where she drew the faces and dreams of students no one else seemed to see. She lived with her grandmother, Dona Nusa, a soft-voiced widow with calloused hands. The two shared a modest home with old furniture, the smell of coffee, and the sound of an AM radio humming softly in the background. Clara had never met her father, and her mother, a victim of deep depression, passed away too soon. Life hadn't offered her easy paths, but instead of growing hard, she turned pain into art. She painted walls, stages, faces, and futures. She taught with her heart, and without even knowing it, she saved lives every single day. That morning, it was raining. Clara arrived at school with her hair tied up in a high bun, her jacket soaked, and her steps hurried. She was late for a city-organized lecture on education and innovation. She had almost skipped it, but something, intuition perhaps, told her she should go. So she did. She entered the small auditorium, took a seat in the back, and exhaled deeply, adjusting her sketchbook on her lap. The host then announced the special presence of one of Brazil's top names in educational technology, Theo Santoro. She had heard the name before, but had never cared much for smiling millionaires who talk about changing the world without ever stepping into the mud. Yet when Theo walked onto the stage, Clara felt something unusual. It wasn't enchantment. It was curiosity. The way he spoke wasn't rehearsed. There was sadness in his eyes, a genuine pause between his phrases, a hollowness disguised in eloquence. And for the first time in a long while, she found herself wondering, who is this man, really? After the talk, Clara didn't have the courage to approach him, but as she was leaving, she accidentally dropped her sketchbook. Theo, rushing behind her, picked it up. When he looked at the hand-drawn cover, a faint smile crossed his lips. "Is this yours?" he asked, holding it out. She took it without looking up much. "Yeah, thanks," and walked away. Theo stood still for a moment, watching her disappear into the soft rain with steps so light it seemed she was dancing without realizing. And in that instant, he felt a different kind of spark, not of desire, but of silent fulfillment. As if, in a simple, accidental encounter, he had found the missing piece he never knew he needed. And Clara, already outside, felt something strange too. She didn't know what to call it, didn't understand it, but inside her, a new question had been born. And for someone who lives through art, questions are seeds of entire worlds. It was supposed to be just another ordinary afternoon. Clara had left school with her shoulders slumped from exhaustion and her fingers stained with gouache paint. She stopped by the neighborhood stationery store, bought 2 cheap paintbrushes, and caught the crowded subway to the city center, where a small exhibition of public school students was taking place. She arrived late as usual, but just in time to see the eyes of a child sparkle at the sight of their own drawing hanging on a white wall. She smiled. That was why she did everything. Across the room, Theo watched from a distance. He was there as a sponsor of the event, but no longer felt at ease in that role. The camera flashes, the formal thank yous, the rehearsed speeches, it all felt hollow. Then he saw her again. Clara, with the same messy bun, a simple blue dress, sketchbook tucked under her arm, and a quiet glow in her eyes. She looked at the paintings as if she could hear music through the colors. He couldn't resist. He slowly crossed the gallery and stopped beside her, pretending to observe the same painting. "Do you think he painted the sky more with what he saw or with what he felt?" he asked, without looking at her. She turned, surprised, but smiled. "With what he felt. Children paint with their hearts first." They laughed, and the conversation that began there unraveled like a forgotten thread from a tightly wound ball. They talked about art, about education, childhood, politics, and pain. Theo found himself sharing things he never told anyone, about the father who cast him out, the loneliness disguised as success, the fear of no longer recognizing himself anywhere. And Clara, listening deeply and silently, received each word as if she were collecting precious stones. At one point, he looked at her more closely. The gallery's soft light illuminated her profile, revealing a serene, unpretentious beauty. But that wasn't what touched him. It was the lightness she carried, despite the marks life had left. It was the way she spoke about simple things with such passion. It was peace. Clara, in turn, began to notice the small cracks in the man the world saw as perfect. He wasn't arrogant. He didn't treat her as lesser. He didn't use money as a shield. It was as if, beside her, Theo could just be human, and somehow that disarmed her. The conversation lasted over an hour. They left the gallery together, walked to a small diner, and ordered 2 coffees. They sat on a bench in the plaza, where the sound of traffic mixed with the breeze and the scent of wet trees. This time, Theo said very little. He just listened. Clara spoke about her classes, her students, her grandmother, about how everything could be more beautiful if people looked at each other with more honesty. He watched her and felt a quiet burning in his chest. It wasn't passion yet. It wasn't desire. It was restlessness. It was as if something inside him had started to stir, something he had spent his entire life trying to keep still. And in that moment, between a sip of coffee and a timid smile, the first crack began to form. Small, subtle, but real. And once the soul begins to crack, there's no way to go back to being whole the same way again. It was strange to feel that way, almost uncomfortable. Like when an unfamiliar song gets stuck in your head and you can't shake it, even without knowing why it struck so deeply. Theo Santoro, who always had sharp answers for everything, now found himself silent in the face of his own soul. He couldn't stop thinking about Clara. It wasn't about her looks or seduction. It was something more abstract, more dangerous. She had accessed a place within him he didn't even know existed. For days, he tried to rationalize it. It was just admiration, a purely intellectual connection, a momentary fascination. But the truth, the one that only shows up when you're lying in the dark, staring at the ceiling in silence, said otherwise. And that truth tore him apart, because it clashed violently with everything he had built, defended, and lived until then. Theo had always been honest about his orientation. He fought for it, got kicked out of his home at 17 for coming out, spent years rebuilding himself, facing prejudice, establishing his place in a world that loved to label love as a matter of choice. Loving Raphael had been his redemption, and it had been real. But now, something was shifting, something unprecedented, and it scared him more than any crisis he'd ever faced. He tried to maintain the routine with Raphael, but the silences grew. The touch lost its meaning. The kiss, once intimate, had become an automatic habit. Raphael didn't demand answers. He just watched, but his eyes said everything. He could feel the distance growing, and Theo hated himself for it. He began avoiding outings, ignored invitations, threw himself into work, and even so, amid spreadsheets and phone calls, Clara's face appeared. Her subtle smile, the glow in her eyes when she talked about her students, the way the wind messed up her hair and she laughed without a care. The dilemma grew inside him like a whisper that turns into a scream, and with it came guilt. Theo didn't want to be unfair to Raphael, but he also didn't want to lie to himself. For the first time, he didn't know who he was. Didn't know if he was gay, if he was bi, or just confused. He only knew one thing. What he felt for Clara wasn't a fantasy. It was real. He tried to run, distanced himself from her, ignored her messages, canceled an event where she'd be. But the heart doesn't obey distance. And the more he tried to bury it, the more alive it became. It wasn't about gender. It was about presence, about soul, about connection. One night, alone on his balcony, Theo cried. For the first time in years. Not just from sadness, but from fear. Fear of disappointing Raphael, fear of being judged, fear of no longer recognizing himself in his own skin, but more than anything, fear of losing the one thing that made him feel whole. And it was there, in the stillness of the night, that he understood. It didn't matter what name he gave to what he was feeling. What mattered was having the courage to stop hiding from himself. Because sometimes, the greatest freedom is allowing yourself to change, even when the whole world expects you to stay the same. Love, when true, feels before it understands. And Raphael felt it. He felt it in the cooling touch, in the words that came less often, in the time Theo started to hide. He already knew the emptiness behind the gaze across the table. He already recognized when someone was there only in body, but he didn't want to believe it. Not him. Not Theo. Not after everything they had built. It was a Saturday afternoon, rainy, silent. Raphael had made homemade lasagna, an attempt to revive one of their old rituals. He waited for hours. Theo arrived late, not hungry, with heavy eyes and a forced smile. He sat at the table, moved the food around without eating, and when Raphael reached his hand across the table, like so many times before, Theo withdrew his hand gently, but with a distance that cut like a knife. "Is something going on?" he asked, his voice lower than he wanted. Theo hesitated. "I'm just tired, Rafa. It's a lot at work." "Since when does your tiredness come with the name of silence?" The sentence hung in the air like a verdict. Theo lowered his gaze, and Raphael knew. He didn't need to ask anymore. The answer was in the way Theo avoided eye contact, in the hug that never came, in the absence that now filled every corner of their home. In the days that followed, Raphael tried to act normal. He kept making breakfast, folding the laundry, tending the plants on the balcony. But inside, everything was falling apart. And the cruelest part was not knowing what he was fighting against. Was there someone else? Or was it just the end? He didn't want an explanation. He wanted the gaze back, the spontaneous smile, the effortless conversation. One day, while organizing the bookshelf, he found one of Theo's notebooks. Curious, he opened it. Inside were scattered thoughts, loose sketches, phrases like, "It's not about betrayal, it's about truth," and "How can I love two worlds without hating myself for it?" Raphael felt a tightness in his chest, and for the first time, he felt anger. Anger for not being included in that pain, for Theo not trusting him enough to speak the truth, for being pushed away without even the chance to fight. It wasn't about losing, it was about being discarded in silence. That night, Raphael stayed awake waiting for him. When Theo got home, the argument was inevitable, but there were no screams, only restrained words, silent tears, and a truth that finally came out. Theo spoke about Clara, about what he was feeling, about what he was trying to understand. Raphael listened, swallowed every word like someone drinking poison, knowing there's no antidote. "Did you love me?" he asked at last. "With all my heart," Theo answered. "Then why didn't you have the courage to tell me sooner?" "Because part of me was still trying to protect you, and part of me just wanted you to be honest." Raphael didn't beg, he didn't break. He just stood up, looked one last time at the man with whom he had shared so many dreams, and went to sleep in the guest room. What they had didn't end that night. It had been ending for a long time. That was just the final breath. And in that silence, Raphael understood what hurts more than being left. It's being forgotten inside someone who still takes up so much space inside you. There was something wrong with that chill in her stomach. Something unsettling, almost uncomfortable. Clara felt it every time Theo appeared. Not because he was intrusive. On the contrary, he was always kind, gentle, respectful. But it was exactly that which left her so confused. Her world was never made for men like him. She was used to broken promises, empty compliments, approaches laced with ulterior motives. The idea that someone like Theo, a millionaire, well-spoken, involved with another man for years, could look at her with honesty was something her mind didn't know where to place. Clara tried to rationalize. "He's just kind to everyone. It's just friendship. It's just admiration." But every time he looked at her with that quiet glow, like someone who sees what no one else does, her heart would race in silence. And that terrified her. She didn't want to feel, didn't want to need anyone, didn't want to be another woman swept away by a beautiful illusion only to be left picking up the pieces. So she pulled away, ignored messages, turned down invites, avoided places he might be. But Theo didn't chase. He waited, patiently. like someone who knows that forcing a butterfly out of its cocoon is the same as keeping it from ever flying. One afternoon, Clara came home early from school. Her grandmother, Dona Nuza, was lying on the couch, eyes closed, listening to the same radio station as always. "Something bothering you, my child?" she asked, with the wisdom of someone who sees beyond what is said. I'm confused, Grandma. There's someone, and I don't know if I can trust him." "You don't need to trust him. You need to trust yourself." That sentence echoed in Clara's mind. That night, she picked up her sketchbook and flipped to the last page. There, roughly sketched, was Theo's face. Soft lines, intense eyes, the expression of someone who carries more than he lets on. She didn't even remember when she'd drawn it, but it was there, and it spoke louder than any rational thought. The next day, Clara went downtown to buy new paints. On the way, she stopped in front of a cafe where she used to meet Theo. She thought about going in, didn't. Walked another block, stopped again, and then, like someone deciding to face their fear, she turned around and stepped inside. Theo was there, sitting by the window, coffee in hand, notebook open. When he saw her, he smiled, not in surprise but with tenderness, like someone who had been waiting. "You came," he said simply. "I'm scared," she replied, sitting across from him. "Of me? Of myself? Of feeling? Of being wrong? Of getting lost?" Theo held his cup gently. "Then let's feel together. Slowly. No rush. No labels. Just truth." Clara looked into his eyes. For the first time, she didn't see the businessman, or someone's ex, or the man too handsome to be real. She saw a human being, broken and whole at once, just like her. And in that moment, she realized that maybe love wasn't a trap, but a brave choice to stay. And what was born there, even when between the smell of coffee and the sound of the city outside, wasn't passion, it was trust. And trust, when planted in the right soil, blooms even in the most wounded heart. There are decisions we don't make all at once. They grow slowly, whispering, taking shape in silence, until the day they no longer fit inside us. And Theo couldn't carry it in silence anymore. The conflict between guilt, his affection for Raphael, the new feelings for Clara, and the public image he had built with so much effort, left him exhausted. It was like being trapped between two worlds, and suffocating in both. For weeks, he lived on autopilot, slept little, ate poorly, avoided meetings, turned down invitations. The company ran without him. The house, silent, had become a mirror of what remained between him and Raphael. Walls still intact on the outside, but cracked within. Clara respected his time. She didn't push. She didn't question. She was simply there, present, but never invasive. And that hurt more than any pressure. Because with her, Theo didn't have to pretend. He didn't have to justify who he was, or weigh what he felt. She saw what he didn't yet have the courage to admit to himself. On a clear-skied night, Theo sat on the balcony and took a deep breath. He could feel the city alive beneath his feet, but inside, everything was suspended. That was the moment he picked up his phone and wrote a short message. "We need to talk. Tomorrow." He sent it to Raphael. No period at the end, because he already knew. The period would come through their eyes. The next morning, he made coffee, the way Raphael liked it, strong and without sugar. He sat at the table, waited. When his partner appeared with deep under-eye circles and a tired expression, Theo was already prepared. But that didn't soften the pain. He looked at him with infinite tenderness. "I don't know where to begin," he confessed. "Then start by being honest," Raphael replied, his voice thick with emotion. Theo told him everything, every detail, about Clara, about what he felt, about the confusion it brought. He didn't lie, didn't hide, didn't romanticize. He just spoke from the heart. And as he spoke, he cried. Cried for hurting someone who had been his safe harbor. Cried for admitting that his heart had moved to another place. Raphael listened in silence. Only one tear escaped. When Theo finished, he took a deep breath and said, "What hurts most isn't losing you. It's knowing you were already lost before you told me." They didn't embrace. They didn't blame each other. They just looked at one another for a few seconds. And in that gaze, they said goodbye to everything they had lived together. It wasn't with anger. It was with love. A love mature enough to understand that, being together isn't always what keeps someone whole. That night, Theo left the home where he had lived for years. He took only a suitcase and the silence of a rupture that, though painful, was necessary. He spent days away from everything. No contact with Clara, no calls, no explanations. He needed to understand who he was now. He needed to relearn how to be alone. But when the silence ended, he knew exactly what he wanted. And for the first time in a long while, there was no doubt, only courage. Courage to rebuild himself with someone new. Courage to face the unknown. Courage to love in a way he never thought possible. The rain that afternoon seemed to fall in perfect rhythm with what Clara felt inside. Outside the school, the drops drew rivers across the cracked pavement, while inside her, her heart was becoming an ocean of doubt. Theo had been distant for days. No calls, no replies, no presence. She tried to convince herself it was for the best, that maybe it had all been a lapse, a misalignment of souls in different phases. But the truth was that the silence hurt more than the absence. Until, on a gray late afternoon, he showed up. Clara was in the school library, helping a student glue together the soaked pages of a project. She heard footsteps, looked up, and there was Theo. Wet hair, dark coat, steady eyes. But there was something new in his expression. Peace. The unrest that used to fill him had made way for a serenity that was almost unsettling. She stood up slowly, her heart racing. "I thought you had disappeared for good," she said, trying to hide the hurt. "I needed to get lost to figure out where I really was," he answered without hesitation. Clara crossed her arms, guarded. "You don't owe me anything, Theo. But I deserve to know. I know. And that's why I'm here. Not to justify, but to be honest." He took a deep breath. "I ended things with Raphael." The silence between them roared like a muted thunder. Clara looked away, trying to process. "Because of me? No. Because of my truth. Because of everything I had been denying. Because I couldn't keep sharing my heart with someone when a part of it was no longer there." She stepped closer. "And where is it now?" "With you." That answer didn't come from impulse or haste. It came with the certainty of someone who had faced the fear of losing himself and chose to love anyway. "I'm scared, Theo," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "So am I," he confessed. "But I can't keep running from what's real. It's not about labels, or past, or future. It's about you, and what you did to the part of me I thought was dead." She stayed silent. Then slowly, she reached out her hand. He held it gently. And there, hand in hand between old shelves and forgotten books, they sealed a promise without promises, to walk together, even without knowing the path. Because sometimes, love doesn't begin with fireworks, but with the courage to stay, even when everything around you screams to run. In Theo's memory, no goodbye had ever hurt as much as that one. There was no drama, no accusations, no scene, just silence. A dense, cutting silence, filled with everything that had once been love, but now needed to be left behind. They had met one last time. No plans, no promises, only to close the chapter with dignity. Because despite the pain, there was still something between them that time, separation, and even new love couldn't erase. Respect. They met at the apartment they once shared. It was empty of furniture, but full of memories. Raphael, thinner, wore a light-colored shirt, his eyes steady but hollow. Theo arrived with slow steps, like someone afraid of stepping over still smoldering ruins. "Thank you for coming," Raphael said, offering a cold coffee. "It was the least I could do. You deserve all my truths." They sat, faced each other for seconds that felt like whole minutes. And then, without needing to rehearse, Theo began to speak. He spoke of what he felt, what he had discovered, and the fear that still walked with him. He talked about Clara, but not with excitement, with care, like someone presenting a wound that had become a flower. And with each word, Raphael listened with the calm of someone who had learned to accept what they cannot control. "You know what hurts the most?" Raphael said finally. "It's not that you love someone else. It's knowing I couldn't be your home forever." "But you were, Rafa," Theo replied, eyes brimming. "You were the most beautiful home I've ever had." They hugged, strongly, for a long time, with silent tears running down their cheeks. It was a goodbye, but also a thank you. Raphael didn't hate him. Theo didn't regret anything. They both knew that even if they were no longer each other's destination, they had been the road, and that was everything. Before leaving, Theo stopped at the door. He looked one last time at that place where so many versions of himself had once lived. "You're still part of my story, Raphael. You always will be. And you of mine. Go in peace. But please, Don't forget to be happy. Theo left with a broken heart, but they were conscious pieces, whole in their pain. It wasn't a breakup out of hate, but out of maturity. It wasn't destruction, it was liberation. And Raphael stayed. Sitting in the empty living room, his eyes lost in memories and the echo of all that never was. And still, he smiled. Because sometimes, truly loving someone is letting go. It's allowing them to find what makes them whole, even if it's not with you. There was a kind of peace Clara had never felt before, a calm that didn't come from certainty, but from truth. And that Saturday afternoon, when she heard knocks on her door, she knew without looking that it was him. Her heart raced, but not from fear. It was as if all the waiting had taught her that love doesn't arrive when we want it to. It arrives when we're ready. Theo stood there, simpler than ever. Gray t-shirt, jeans, a small bouquet of daisies in his hands, and the most unguarded eyes she had ever seen. I didn't bring promises, just desire, he said. And courage? She asked with a quiet smile. That too, for the first time, all of it. They sat on the porch. The sky was golden, caught between afternoon and evening. Donna Noisa, as always listening to the radio in her room, pretended not to hear, but heard everything. Theo spoke of the days away, of the end with Raphael, of the doubts, the fear, and the decision that, in the end, wasn't about liking men or women, but about who made him breathe with truth. I don't want to hurt you, he said, gently holding her hands, or idealize you. I just want to live you, whatever that means. And if it goes wrong? Clara asked, eyes shimmering. Then we live it anyway, because I'd rather fail with you than live my whole life without trying. And then it happened, not like in the movies. No soundtrack, no slow motion, just a kiss. Simple, honest, full of hesitation and tenderness. A kiss without certainty, but filled with space. Space to feel, to begin, to try. Clara pulled back slowly, eyes still closed. You're not what I expected, Theo. Neither are you, he replied, smiling. You're better. That night was made of slow conversations, interlaced fingers, and shy plans. They didn't label it, didn't hold on too tightly. They just allowed it. And for the first time in a long while, they both slept peacefully. Not because they knew the future, but because they had made peace with the present. And when morning came and the sun poured through the window of the humble house that smelled of coffee and played AM radio, Theo looked at Clara still asleep and thought, now I'm home. The October sun streamed through the old stained glass windows of the small countryside church as if the sky itself wanted to witness that moment. The flowers on the pews were simple, daisies and lavender, picked the day before by Clara and her grandmother. There was no orchestra, no luxury, no crowd, but there was something rarely seen, even at the most expensive weddings. Truth. Theo Santoro, the man who had once worn the finest suits in the country, now wore a light jacket, no tie, with a handmade brooch on his chest, a gift from one of Clara's students. His eyes, usually steady and sharp, were now filled with tears, surrendered, unguarded. He looked toward the entrance of the church, his heart racing, as if every beat confirmed that the impossible can indeed happen. And then she walked in. Clara wore a white dress made of light fabric, sewn by her grandmother. No veil, no jewelry, just the afternoon light brushing her shoulders and that shy, emotional smile that made Theo forget every day he had ever doubted himself. She walked slowly, but with steady steps. Her eyes didn't tremble. They said, I choose you, not out of need, but out of presence. The ceremony was led by an elderly priest, his voice gentle, speaking more with his eyes than his mouth. There were no long vows, just hands held, eyes exchanged, and two breaths broken by emotion. Theo, do you choose to love this woman with all that you are, without trying to change her, without erasing who she was before you came? I do, and I'm grateful she didn't give up on me before I found myself. Clara, do you choose to walk beside this man, even if his past doesn't fit into simple explanations? I do, because his truth makes me feel more alive than any comfortable lie ever could. When the priest declared them united, the church erupted into soft applause and quiet tears. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was a real wedding, between real people, with crooked stories, complex pasts, and a whole present standing before them. Outside, the sky was orange. Clara tossed the bouquet, and it landed in the hands of a young girl from the community. Theo hugged Dona Nusa tightly. And then, walking hand in hand among the guests, the two looked at each other and smiled with the quiet certainty. Life begins again every time we choose love, even when it comes in the most unlikely way. And as they climbed into the small truck that would take them to the farmhouse where they'd spend the night, dust rising behind them, Theo felt something he had never felt before. Peace. Peace for facing his fears. Peace for honoring Raphael with truth. Peace for choosing Clara. Peace for, finally, choosing himself. Across the street from the church, between old trees and a moss-covered stone wall, Raphael Diniz watched from afar. He hadn't been invited, nor had he expected to be, but he couldn't ignore that day either. Something inside him needed to see, with his own eyes, that the story they had lived, no matter how beautiful, had truly come to an end. He wore a light gray suit, simple, and a pair of shoes worn by time. In his hands, a single white flower, not to give, but to remember that love, when real, never dies. It only transforms. He arrived before the guests, sat on a park bench directly across from the side entrance of the chapel, watched the preparations, the arrivals, Clara's discreet smiles, Theo's nervous glances, and not once did he look away. It was painful, but also necessary. Like closing a book you loved reading, even if the ending wasn't the one you wished for. When Clara entered the church, Raphael held his breath, not because he wished to be in Theo's place, but because he finally understood what Theo had meant when he spoke of her. There was something in that woman that calmed the world around her. Throughout the ceremony, Raphael remained still. He didn't cry, but his eyes were red. And when the bells rang, announcing the new union, he simply smiled. A sad smile, mature, and profoundly freeing. Few noticed he was there, but Clara, she did. As she exited the church, hand in hand with Theo, her eyes met his. For a moment, the two recognized each other, two strangers silently sharing the same love for the same man. Raphael gave a small nod. Clara answered with a brief, sincere smile. Then, he stood, placed the white flower on the stone bench where he had waited, and walked away. No rush, no guilt, no bitterness. As he walked through the quiet streets of that village, Raphael felt the weight of goodbye shift into something lighter. Gratitude, for having lived a love that deep, for having been a home, for letting Theo go, even with his heart raw and aching. Because in the end, truly loving someone was never about possession, but about freedom. And with that quiet step along the cobblestone path, Raphael closed a chapter of his own life. A chapter that hurt to end, but that, paradoxically, left room for a beginning. The house was simple. Light wood, wide windows facing the sunset, and white curtains that danced with the afternoon breeze. Around it, the scent of wild lavender, the sound of crickets, and a dirt road that seemed to lead not to a place, but to a different kind of time. There, between silence and nature, Theo and Clara began again. It wasn't a life of luxury. There were no imported cars or crowded schedules. Days began with fresh bread baked in a wood-fired oven by Dona Nusa, coffee brewed in a cloth strainer, and Clara barefoot on the porch, reading letters from students who missed her. Theo planted, Theo wrote, Theo read, and for the first time, Theo truly breathed. Sometimes they walked hand in hand to the village to buy fruit. They stopped to chat with neighbors, laughed with children, offered help. Slowly, the man who had once graced the covers of business magazines became simply Clara's Theo. And he liked that. He was proud of that. It was as if he had finally been pulled out of a stained glass window where he'd always been admired, but never truly touched. At night, they shared simple dinners, low lights, old songs playing softly in the background. They talked about everything, the past, the future, how hard it had been to get there. They laughed at contradictions, cried when remembering Raphael, and embraced the wounds that still lingered, because they knew true peace is not the absence of pain, it's learning to live alongside it. One Sunday, while painting the garden wall together with quotes from books they loved, Clara looked at Theo and asked, "Do you miss that old life?" He answered without hesitation, "I miss the version of me who didn't yet know what real love was, and today, I do." She smiled, pulled him by the shirt, and kissed him, with the ease of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. And there, between stained brushes and entwined hands, they knew they didn't need much, just each other, and room to keep growing. In the distance, The sky painted the world in hues of orange and lilac, and the dirt road, always there, seemed to promise that what is simple, when lived with truth, becomes eternal. Years had passed since the day Theo Santoro said yes at the altar of a modest church with windows colored by sunlight. The world outside kept spinning in a hurry, but he had learned to live in the rhythm of the soul. A time with no clocks, no headlines, no duties that wound. A time where love exists as it is, imperfect, improbable, but whole. Clara now led an artistic education project for children in vulnerable situations. She painted murals in forgotten villages, taught color where there had once only been concrete. Theo, in turn, turned his life experience into talks about choice, identity, and freedom. Not as a guru, not as a martyr, but as a man who dared to break his own certainties in order to live what was real. Raphael had followed his own path. He married years later to a nurse with whom he had quietly shared long hospital shifts. He and Theo maintained a discreet friendship, emails on meaningful dates, sincere wishes for happiness. Because life, when lived truthfully, doesn't create enemies. It creates stories that evolve. One afternoon, with streaks of gray in his hair, Theo walked down the dirt road beside Clara, now pregnant with their first child. The two moved in silence, as if each step on that trail were a quiet thank you. In the background, the sound of trees, cicadas, and life continuing even when we think it has paused. He looked at her, and she looked back. There was no more doubt, no more fear, only presence. "Do you still think all of this was a mistake?" Clara asked, with that smile that had always disarmed him. "If it was, I'm glad we had the courage to make it," he replied. "Because of all the roads I could have taken, yours was the only one that brought me back to myself." She rested her head on his shoulder, and there, between the dust of the road and the golden sky, their love said everything, without needing words. Because in the end, true love doesn't follow rules, doesn't fit into definitions, and isn't measured by logic. It simply exists, and those who dare to live it find not only the other, but themselves.